If they were going to be a successful pop band in the way that the Beatles were, they had to start writing their own songs. They couldn't carry on covering blues and R&B songs forever. There's the famous story that Andrew Oldham tells of virtually locking Mick and Keith in his kitchen and saying, "You ain't coming out until you've come up with a song." The Last Time was the first Jagger Richards composition to go to #1. Probably in terms of their writing, the key moment comes a little bit later, and it's the night they're on tour in America in some god-awful hotel in the Midwest, and Keith wakes up having dreamt the riff to Satisfaction.
Written in May 1965, Satisfaction was the breakthrough track for the Stones, their first undisputed classic, and it was dominated by Richards' powerhouse riff, which still stands as one of the most famous and recognizable guitar lines in the history of popular music.
Well, what we know is that Keith has talked about that riff as being suggestive of a horn section as you'd hear on an R&B record. They were all R&B fans, ardent R&B fans. They'd listened to Otis Redding and Wilson Pickett and all the Motown records and, of course, all the Stax records. And so when you heard those horn sections, you couldn't help but be attracted to them and want to incorporate them in your own style. So he's often talked about the idea behind the riff to Satisfaction, almost as if you would hear it with a horn section instead of a single guitar. Now, the way you'd make that sound big on the guitar is, rather than a feeble, decaying guitar tone that you had in those days, you would simply boost it. And the most boosting that could be done in those days was putting massive fuzz on it. There was a device called a fuzz tone, and he actually used an old Gibson Maestro fuzz tone that Les Paul, I believe, was one of the first guys that used it on record. And they used that as a sound effect to color the guitar and make it sound huge.
The first commercial use of a fuzz box was in 1961 when an artist called Anne Magritte used one on a song called I Just Don't Understand. And then after that, it sort of, faded away for a bit. And then I think Keith acquired one on an American tour. And he put his guitar through it for Satisfaction. And I think at the back of his mind, he visualised using sort of horns on it, as they did later on with Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby? But in fact, it was quite effective as it was. And in fact, rather than sort of emanating a saxophone, I think because of Keith, it assumed a personality of its own.
I can't get no satisfaction. I can't get me no satisfaction, babe, 'cause I try. And I try, yeah, I try, yeah, I try.
That was the sort of record you felt like, hey, I should have made that, It's just so good.
The Stones have been building up this tremendous momentum over the early 60s, and I don't know whether people expected Satisfaction, but it was a kind of an explosion, really, of a song which was absolutely perfect for them and perfect for the whole pop-rock revolution that was happening. It all came to Keith Richards in a dream one night, apparently the riff, and when he wrote it, he wasn't convinced it would be a hit single. He wasn't fully confident that it would actually be a sensible song for the Stones to perform, ironically. And I think it was Andrew Oldham who encouraged him to, you've got to make this a single. This has got to be the single. And they tried a few different versions of it before it finally settled into the Satisfaction that we know and love, with the very powerful stomping beat from Charlie and Bill.
Just in terms of its fuzziness, the kind of sound it has, it's really dirty. And that's one of the reasons it's so great, although if it wasn't for the tune itself, it would mean nothing.
Satisfaction is where the myth of Keith Richards as the human riff begins. Jagger then puts these fantastic words to it, and the Stones never look back. I mean, this is the pivotal moment in their development.
The worldwide success of the record changed the dynamic within the band, and now Keith and Mick were to lead the Rolling Stones into their first classic period, with hit after hit coming from original compositions.
It's as if they come out of their blues derivation and that whole sort of R&B scene in Richmond and so forth, and they really find their own musical character, Jagger and Richards, in that song.
From then on, Stones records were built on Keith riffs. Obviously this sidelined Brian because he was no longer the dominant frontman, no longer the leader of the band, and now he was no longer the driving force musically, so he had to content himself with doing something that did become essential to the Stone sound, which was mastering, with this amazing talent he had, any instrument he cared to pick up, whether it be the dulcimer, the sitar for Paint It Black, the recorder, anything. He seemed to be able to play anything, and it gave those 60s Stones records, after the initial blues thing had kind of mutated into their own sound, it just gave them their mid-60s proto-psychedelic sound, not yet full-fledged, but they were very exotic thanks to Brian.
Very different from that of the Beatles, indeed from the Kinks or anyone else, and it had a kind of swagger to it.
Whereas that voice was perfectly captured on their fourth studio album, Aftermath, by 1967 it had been diluted slightly by the predominant trends of British pop. Their album Between the Buttons had less swagger than their fans had come to expect, and Richards and Jagger's songs had lost the raw energy that had elevated them to the top of their field 2 years before.
The kind of authority that those early Rolling Stones albums had was certainly missing for something like Between the Buttons. Between the Buttons is a charming record, but you don't go to the Rolling Stones for charm. There was those 12 by 5 or the Rolling Stones Now. Those records just had such heat and confidence.
Yet the music soon became the least of the Stones' worries. In February 1967, Richard's Sussex home, Redlands, was raided, and he and Jagger were later charged. The most notable drugs bust of